The capital of the Selenian Empire stood as an impregnable monument to order. Here, in the sprawling megacity of Rydia, the Emperor's rule was absolute, enforced not just by a fleet of warships that could darken whole star systems, but by something even more pervasive: the Augmented Guard. These elite enforcers, enhanced by neural implants and cloaked in gleaming exo-armor, patrolled every thoroughfare and controlled every district. They didn't simply ensure the law was followed, they defined it, molded it, turned it to the Emperor's will. At the heart of Rydia, rising like a black spear through the haze of neon lights and ever-present drones, was the Imperium Spire. Its summit housed the Council of Sovereignty, a chamber that once echoed with the fierce debates of the Senate. Those days were long gone. Now the chamber was a sterile arena for the Emperor's speeches, a place where he could reaffirm his grip on the galaxy with the kind of precision only a machine mind could muster. Emperor Audax was more than a man. His neural implant, the crown core, linked his mind to every system in the Empire. It allowed him to override any device, any network, any data stream at will. With a single thought, he could turn the machinery of an entire planet against its people. He was omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, or so it seemed. Cale Merrick, a former senator and now one of the leaders of the resistance, knew otherwise. He had spent years working within the shadows, piecing together scraps of information that had slipped through the Emperor's vast web of control. He had uncovered the truth about the Crown Core. For all its power, it wasn't infallible. It relied on a critical uplink housed deep within the Imperium Spire. Disrupt the uplink, and the Emperor would lose his technological omnipotence. He would be vulnerable, perhaps even mortal. Cale stood in a dingy underground chamber lit by the flickering glow of outdated holo-terminals. Around him, a small group of rebels, technicians, disillusioned officers, even a few ex-senators, watched as he activated a projection of the Imperium Spire's schematics. "The plan is simple," he said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was about to propose. "We infiltrate the Spire. We place the nullifier at the uplink junction. Once it's active, the Crown Core will shut down, and the Emperor will be as defenseless as any of us." A murmur ran through the group. It wasn't just the technical risks that worried them. It was the aftermath. Bringing down the Emperor was one thing. Building a new order from the ashes of the old was another entirely, but they all knew this moment couldn't be delayed. The galaxy was suffocating under the Empire's grip. Entire star systems were collapsing into poverty, their resources drained to feed the Emperor's ever-growing military machine. Kyle continued. "The galaxy needs to see that the Emperor can be brought low. For too long his power has seemed invincible, his will unbreakable. If we show the people that he's just a man who can be challenged, who can be defeated, then the resistance won't just be a whisper in the shadows. It'll be a roar that the Empire can't silence." He paused, letting his words sink in. The group exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. Finally, one of the older senators nodded. "We've waited long enough," she said. "Let's end this." Kyle felt a flicker of hope. The plan was set. The galaxy watched in silence now, but not for long. The time to strike was at hand. The day began like any other in the Senate chambers. The Emperor's voice boomed through the chamber's high vaults, his speech a mechanical symphony of power. Every word was carefully measured, each syllable crafted to remind the galaxy who ruled. 1,000 star systems tuned in to watch. The senators sat stiffly in their designated seats, their faces frozen in masks of compliance. They knew their role in this performance: to sit, to listen, to applaud on cue. Kyle Merrick sat in the lower rows, draped in the crimson robe of a minor envoy. His fingers gripped the edge of his chair as he stole glances at the upper galleries. The broadcast drones hovered silently, their cameras sweeping over the senators and lingering on the Emperor's dark form. A holographic display projected his image across the chamber, larger than life. Cale could feel the heat of the spotlight, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was the moment they had planned for months, years even. The nullifier was already in place, hidden deep within the spire's maze-like infrastructure. The Resistance's best engineers had risked everything to smuggle it past the augmented guard. With one signal, Kyle would activate it, shutting down the Emperor's neuro-override implant. But timing was everything. Too early, and the Emperor's loyalists would overwhelm them. Too late, and their chance would slip away. As the Emperor's speech droned on about loyalty, stability, and unity, Cale's earpiece crackled softly. It was Lena, one of the Resistance's tech specialists, speaking in a low whisper. "In position, standing by." Kyle's heart pounded. He reached into his robe, fingers brushing against the slim transmitter. If this worked, the Emperor would be vulnerable, cut off from the Crown Corps. He would be just a man. Kyle stood suddenly, cutting through the monotony of the Emperor's words. "Your Majesty," he called out, his voice steady but carrying an edge of defiance. The other senators turned, startled. It was almost unthinkable for anyone to interrupt the Emperor's carefully orchestrated addresses. The Emperor paused mid-sentence, his head tilting slightly as his glowing visor fixed on Cale. "Speak," came the cold metallic voice. "This chamber is more than a stage for your proclamations," Cale said, stepping forward. "It is the heart of the galaxy's government, a place of debate, of justice, of accountability." A hush fell over the room. No one had dared to speak in such terms in decades. Cale could see the tension in the senators' faces. Some alarmed, others intrigued, but the Emperor remained still, silent. Cale took a breath. "You've ruled by fear, by control, but power without accountability is tyranny." A flicker of motion drew Cale's attention to the Emperor's hand. He was reaching toward a control panel embedded in his throne. Cale knew what was coming. A command would be sent to the augmented guard, and Cale would be dead before he could take another step. But then Cale pressed the transmitter. The lights in the chamber flickered. A sharp electronic whine pierced the air. The Emperor jerked forward, his hand freezing mid-motion. His glowing visor dimmed, then flickered out entirely. He slumped in his throne, head bowed. The chamber was utterly silent. Cale moved quickly. He leapt onto the dais, reaching the Emperor's throne before the guards could react. With one arm he hoisted the Emperor to his feet. Without the Crown Corps, Audax was no longer an invincible machine of governance. He was a dazed, disoriented man. "What is the meaning of this?" shouted one of the loyalist senators, but their voice trembled. The other senators simply watched, paralyzed. Cale turned, dragging the Emperor forward, down the steps of the dais. "The Emperor is under arrest," Cale declared. His voice carried through the chamber, amplified by the stunned silence. "In the name of the Senate, and of all the free people of this galaxy." A murmur rippled through the chamber, then fell silent again. No one moved to stop him. Not yet. The augmented guard hesitated, unsure how to respond without the commands of their master. The broadcast drones continued to hover, transmitting the entire scene. Across the galaxy, the people saw what they had never imagined possible. The Emperor, defeated, being dragged from his throne. Cale marched forward, the Emperor stumbling in his grip. As they reached the main doors, Cale could feel the shift in the air. The senators, the guards, even the galaxy itself. Everything was on the edge of something new. For the first time in generations, the galaxy watched, stunned, and began to whisper among themselves. If the Emperor could be overthrown, Cale Merrick had never felt so exposed. Every sound, a distant clanging, a faint shout, seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 pursuers. As he dragged the dazed emperor through the Senate's labyrinthine halls, he could hear the scrape of armored boots in the distance. The augmented guard was mobilizing. The Senate halls were not as they had been in the days of the Republic. Centuries of authoritarian rule had reshaped them into a fortress of corridors and checkpoints. Each hallway was designed to funnel threats into killing zones, each bulkhead reinforced to withstand orbital bombardment. Kyle's small team of resistance fighters, 4 in total, including himself, had prepared for this escape as much as they could, but they were still just shadows moving through a predator's den. "Lena," Kale called out, his voice low but urgent. His grip on the Emperor was firm, though his shoulders burned from the strain of supporting the dead weight of the once mighty ruler. "I'm here," Lena replied. She was several paces ahead, moving quickly but carefully. She was their slicer, the one who had made the nullifier work, and now she was their guide through the labyrinth. Her datapad flickered as she brought up a schematic. "We need to get to the west maintenance shaft. It'll bypass the next guard station." Kyle nodded, dragging the Emperor forward. Audax was still out of it, his implant shut down and his body struggling to adjust to its absence. He mumbled something incoherent, his once commanding voice now a rasp. Kyle felt a flash of pity, quickly followed by anger. This man had turned countless worlds into graveyards and reduced the Senate to a rubber stamp. He could endure being pulled down a few hallways. "Take the next left," Lena whispered, and the team slipped into another dimly lit corridor. The walls were bare metal, the kind that made every footstep echo like a drumbeat. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder. One of Kale's team, Rico, glanced over his shoulder. "They're catching up." Kale gritted his teeth. They had no choice but to keep moving. "Lena, where's that shaft?" "Just ahead," she said, quickening her pace. "Once we're in, I can seal it behind us." As they rounded the corner, they spotted it. A narrow maintenance hatch recessed into the wall. Lena crouched and began working, her fingers flying over the keypad. For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the electronics and the faint, distant shouts of guards. "It's open," Lena said, pulling the hatch wide. "Go." Kyle gestured for the others to climb in first. Rico and Sana, their weapons at the ready, disappeared into the darkness. Lena followed. Kyle heaved the Emperor through the opening, then slid in after him. Once inside, Lena sealed the hatch behind them. The sounds of pursuit were abruptly muffled but not gone. The maintenance shaft was cramped and cold, its walls lined with exposed pipes and flickering lights. It wasn't designed for human passage, and every step was awkward. Kyle's shoulders scraped against the walls as he dragged Audax forward. The Emperor stumbled, his breath ragged, but he managed to keep moving. There was no room for hesitation. If they stopped, the augmented guard would find them, and they'd be trapped like animals. "What's the next step?" Rico asked, his voice tense. "We can't just crawl through shafts forever." "We're heading for the transport level," Lena said, glancing at her datapad. "There's an old emergency hangar they don't monitor anymore. We have a ship stash there." Kyle nodded, though the plan seemed more precarious by the second. If the guard found them before they reached that ship, it would all be over. No trial, no revolution. Just another failed uprising crushed in silence. They moved quickly, every sound amplified in the confined space. Kale could feel the weight of the Emperor slowing them down, but he didn't let go. If they left Audax behind, the mission would lose its meaning. He had to stand trial. He had to face the galaxy he'd ruled so mercilessly. "Keep moving," Kale said. "We're almost there." But deep down, he wasn't sure if they'd make it. The halls above them were teeming with loyalists, and every minute brought them closer. The galaxy might be watching, but Kale knew they were still holding their breath. They'd done it. Somehow, against all odds, they had reached the transport level, boarded their smuggled ship, and escaped the Imperium spire. The resistance cell had scattered to their safe houses, each member taking a different path to avoid immediate capture. But the galaxy's greatest victory wasn't in slipping past the augmented guard or hiding from the fleet. It was what followed. Cale Merrick didn't have to push for a trial. The moment the news broke, broadcast drones carrying the footage of the Emperor's downfall to every corner of the Empire. Worlds that had remained passive for generations demanded justice. The Senate was forced to respond. They convened an emergency tribunal, the first of its kind in centuries, held in a neutral zone between star systems. The proceedings were live-streamed to the galaxy, an unfiltered window into what had once been unthinkable, the Emperor of the Selenian Empire being judged by his own people. The chamber was no longer the cold, sterile theater of the Spire. Instead, it was a repurposed assembly hall aboard a massive neutral station, chosen for its isolation from the Empire's core worlds. A circular platform served as the center stage, ringed by rows of seats where representatives from dozens of star systems sat, their faces a mix of awe, apprehension, and defiance. At the heart of it all sat Audax, the once unstoppable ruler, now stripped of his cybernetic might. Without the crown core, he looked smaller, frailer, though his eyes still held a spark of defiance. He wore simple, undecorated robes, his armored regalia confiscated, and his implant permanently deactivated. He had no guards, no attendants, just himself, seated before the assembled tribunal. Cale sat in the gallery, alongside Lena, Rico, and a few other resistance leaders. The air was electric. For the first time, the Emperor would have to speak, for himself, not through the booming authority of his enhanced voice or the chilling clarity of a synthetic mind. He would have to answer to the galaxy he had ruled without mercy. The lead magistrate, a grizzled former senator named Hallan Orvek, opened the proceedings. "Emperor Audax," she began, her voice steady. "You stand accused of crimes against sentient life, genocide, enslavement, and the subjugation of free will. How do you plead?" Audax straightened, his voice low and measured. "I do not recognize this tribunal's authority. I am the Emperor of the Selenian Empire, the keeper of order and unity." A murmur rippled through the gallery. "But, Magistrate," Orvek silenced it with a gesture. "Your titles hold no weight here, Audax. You will answer the charges." For hours, the tribunal presented its case. The testimony of survivors from raised colonies, evidence of forced augmentations where entire populations had been fitted with neuro-implants to ensure obedience, records of planetary bombardments that had wiped out entire cities for the sake of efficiency, the holographic projections, the first-hand accounts, the raw data, all laid bare for the galaxy to see. Audax's defense was cold, calculated. He spoke of necessity, of order, of how his unyielding rule had prevented chaos from consuming the galaxy. He described his reign not as tyranny, but as a singular effort to preserve civilization in a dangerous universe. He pointed to the long centuries of peace enforced by his unrelenting grip. "Without my guidance," he declared, "this galaxy will tear itself apart. You sit here judging me, but you owe your very existence to the stability I have provided. Remove me, and you will see how quickly that stability crumbles." Kyle felt a chill at Audax's words. The Emperor's voice, stripped of its synthetic enhancements, still carried a chilling conviction. But Cale had witnessed the cost of that stability. He had walked through the ruins of planets that would never rebuild, met refugees who had lost everything, and watched as entire cultures were erased for the sake of imperial efficiency. When it was his turn to testify, Cale stood before the tribunal and spoke of those things. He spoke not as a soldier, not as a revolutionary, but as someone who had once believed in the system. "I was a senator," Cale said, his voice steady. I believed that even under the Emperor, we could work toward a better future. But I was wrong. The Emperor does not rule to protect the galaxy. He rules to control it, to crush any spark of independence. The stability he speaks of is built on the ashes of our freedom. His words resonated. In the galleries, the murmurs grew. Louder. Across the stars, citizens tuned into the broadcasts, miners on distant moons, traders in bustling spaceports, farmers on backwater colonies. They had lived under the Emperor's rule, and now they saw it laid bare. The narrative was no longer controlled by imperial propagandists. The galaxy was finally hearing the truth. When the tribunal concluded its hearing, it was clear that this trial was no longer just about the Emperor. It was a reckoning for the entire empire. Worlds began to stir. On distant planets, rebellions broke out. On others, celebrations erupted. People were waking up, realizing that the silence they had lived in for so long could be shattered. Kale watched as the lead magistrate turned to Audax for a final statement. The Emperor rose, his face impassive, and said, "I have no regrets. History will remember me as the one who kept the galaxy united. I only fear for what comes next." It was a haunting warning, but the tribunal was unmoved. Magistrate Orvex spoke the words the galaxy had waited for. "Audax, the Senate condemns you for your crimes. You will be held until a final sentence is decided." As the chamber erupted in voices, some triumphant, some fearful, Kale sat back. The galaxy wasn't silent anymore. The Emperor had been brought low, and now the real work would begin. Yeah, people would have to decide what kind of future they wanted, and that future wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in centuries, the Emperor was guilty. The tribunal's verdict had shattered the myth of his invincibility, but it also unleashed a storm across the galaxy. As the Senate deliberated on his ultimate sentence, loyalist factions mobilized, unwilling to accept a world without their ruler. Imperial fleets, once unassailable, fractured. Some commanders swore allegiance to the new Senate-led coalition. Others declared martial law in the name of restoring order. The galaxy was no longer silent, but it was far from stable. Kyle Merrick watched it unfold from the command center of a newly formed rebel council, set up in the relative safety of a distant frontier station. Reports came in every hour, new uprisings, skirmishes on backwater moons, and planets declaring independence. Some systems tried to restore their old republics. Others splintered into regional powers led by warlords or opportunistic governors. The Empire's iron grip had shattered, and in its place was a maelstrom of voices, each clamoring for something different. Kale stood by the long viewport, looking out at a swirling nebula, his thoughts heavy. The galaxy's silence was broken, but the noise was deafening. "You should rest," Lena said, approaching him with a cup of something warm. Her voice was gentle, but there was tension behind it. They were all tired, running on determination alone. "It's not on you to fix everything overnight." Kale shook his head. "It's not about fixing it all. It's about making sure we don't lose what we've started." The truth was, Kale hadn't expected the galaxy to change so quickly. He had spent so long planning how to tear down the Emperor's regime that he hadn't thought much about what came next. Now the galaxy was looking to him and the other resistance leaders for guidance. They weren't just insurgents anymore. They were seen as the architects of a new order. It was a role Kale hadn't asked for, and one he wasn't sure he wanted. News of the Loyalist coup came quickly. A fleet of Imperial warships still loyal to Audax had seized a key trading hub and announced their intention to restore the Emperor's rightful rule. They were led by Admiral Selvar, a hardened commander who had served as Audax's enforcer for decades. Selvar's forces were well equipped, and their announcement was clear. They would march on the neutral station housing the tribunal and free the Emperor. It was a bid to reignite the old order, and it threatened to undo everything. "We can't let them reach the tribunal," Kale said, slamming a fist against the viewport frame. "If Selvar breaks the Emperor out, we'll lose all credibility. It'll be chaos." "We don't have a fleet big enough to stop them," Rico pointed out, his voice calm but grim. "Most of the Loyalist forces are still intact. We have scattered cells, some local defense fleets, a few defectors, that's it." Kale turned back to face them, his determination hardening. "We have one advantage. The galaxy is watching. The same people who cheered when we dragged Audax out of the Senate halls are still out there. If they see the Loyalists trying to seize power again, they'll resist. We can't fight Selvar ship to ship, but we can rally people. Turn this into a battle of the people against tyranny, not just rebels versus Loyalists." The resistance. Leaders exchanged glances. Lena nodded slowly. "If we get the word out, show them what's at stake, we might have a chance. But we'll need time." "Then we give them a reason to hold the line," Kyle said. "We can't let Selvar's forces reach that tribunal. If we have to, we'll delay them ourselves." It was a desperate gamble, but it was all they had. Over the next few days, Kale and his team sent out broadcast after broadcast, calling on planets, stations, and colonies to stand against Selvar's advance. The galaxy was fractured, but those who had tasted hope for the first time in generations weren't ready to see it snuffed out. Independent defense forces sprang into action. Civilian ships formed blockades. On some planets, uprisings erupted against Imperial garrisons still loyal to the old regime. The final confrontation came at the edge of the frontier, where Selvar's fleet tried to break through to the neutral station. Kale's hastily assembled forces, barely a fleet by any real standard, met them there. It was a battle of ideals as much as firepower. The Loyalists had the advantage in numbers and technology, but the rebels and their allies fought as though their lives depended on it, because they did. For every ship Selvar's fleet destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. Civilians joined the fight in droves, piloting freighters armed with improvised weapons. They weren't just fighting for their homes, they were fighting for the idea that the galaxy could be something other than a dictatorship. In the end, it was the Emperor's absence that turned the tide. Without Audax's neural network directing the fleet, the Loyalist forces lacked their usual coordination. Selvar was skilled, but he was only one commander. The rebel forces, while disorganized, fought with an intensity that Selvar's troops couldn't match. When his flagship finally fell, the Loyalist fleet scattered. Kyle stood on the bridge of his commandeered cruiser, watching as the remains of Selvar's fleet fled. He felt relief, but also a sense of unease. This wasn't the end. The galaxy was free from the Emperor's grip, but it was still far from united. There were no easy answers. Worlds that had lived under the Empire's heel for centuries would need time to rebuild, to find their own voices. Some would flourish, others would struggle. The trial concluded in the aftermath, with Audax officially sentenced to confinement in a secure facility far from any system of importance. He would live out his days powerless, his reign a bitter memory. But the tribunal's verdict wasn't the final word. The galaxy was already rewriting its story, piece by piece, in a cacophony of voices that refused to be silenced. As Kyle stood before the Resistance Council, now a fledgling provisional government, he spoke simply. "The galaxy is ours to shape. Let's make something better." The silence that had defined the Empire was gone. In its place was a chorus of hope, anger, fear, and ambition. It was messy, chaotic, and alive. For the first time in generations, the galaxy wasn't watching from the sidelines. It was taking its future into its own hands.